All right, what's a good way to start this? I don't know. Just, hey, sup? So this week's video was inspired by a question I had someone ask me recently. They just asked me it briefly because they had heard somebody else that they knew ask this question, and they kind of felt like something was off with the person's statement of the phrase, and that is that they said, oh, you know, in the 18th century, classical music was just like pop music of today. And they texted me this question and just were kind of like, how accurate is this statement? And I answered their question a while back, but then that got me thinking, you know, maybe I should make a video kind of talking about this talking point. It's something that I don't know if everybody really thinks about or knows the answer to. And even then, I still think there's a group of people who are like, I think I kind of know the answer, but I can't really explain why. So I thought it would be an interesting topic to kind of talk about. So starting with that question, was classical music the pop music of its day? Well, to better answer that question, we kind of have to kind of look at what are we asking when we ask, was classical music pop music? Are we kind of essentially saying, was Beethoven like the Cardi B of his day? Just saying that, it feels a little weird and it feels a little off. I mean, personality traits of the two people aside, it's something doesn't seem to quite click. Well, in one sense, technically, no, because classical music of the previous era is classical music of today. That would be the equivalent of it because it stayed the same, but that's not really what people are asking. They're asking what we consider to be pop music. Is that the same kind of context that classical music had when it was being created in its time? So then that kind of makes us have to look at pop music. So what is pop music? How do we define pop music of today? Well, it's kind of a tricky question because pop music isn't a super specific genre. It kind of is, but it kind of isn't at the same time, because pop music is kind of its own genre, but then it also encompasses a couple other genres as well. So I think the easiest way to describe it and define it for the purposes of this video is to understand it as music that is consumed by the masses of the people. Popular music, so music that is popular, that your average everyday person is likely to listen to. And this style has changed throughout time, and it's different now than it was even like 10 years ago. But you have that idea in your head. You know what to think of when we think of popular music. This is the music you're most likely to hear if you hear background music while you're shopping. This is the music you're likely to hear in commercials. This is the stuff that's on the top of all the Billboard lists, etc., etc. You get that general idea. That's what we think of when we say pop music. So compare this to the context that classical music had in its heyday when it was composed. Well, like I've talked about in a few of my videos where I went through the eras of music history, a lot of classical music had a specific context that it was being composed for. Rather than it just being for people to listen to, it was typically meant for some kind of purpose. This could range from being written for church music to entertainment for a specific group of people, like nobles for a party, or entertainment for maybe a select group of people to sit and listen to that were a little bit more in the upper class. This was a lot of, especially in the earlier days, this is a lot of what classical music was composed for. And even when you go into the 19th and 20th century, when classical music does start to shift its focus to being more for the masses, it still is this context of it's being written for a concert setting, or it's being written for some kind of event that people pay tickets to go and see. And within all of these different contexts, classical music tends to have this artistic undertone to it. It's not just any old casual regular song, it does always seem to have an underlying theme of being more artistic. Sort of like the difference for back in the day, if you just wanted your portrait drawn up real quick to stick it in a locket, versus somebody actually going out and painting a big significant royal figure. Those two pieces of art are going to be very different. One is for the everyday person, the other is for a specific heightened context. And that's typically where we see a lot of classical music pieces. So Brahms, for example, is going to be writing his symphonies for an orchestra to play. That's a more heightened context than your casual everyday person just wanting something quick to listen to. So if classical music is more of an artistic style of music rather than generic popular music, what was popular music back in the day then? Well, popular music definitely existed, but the stuff that was popular for the everyday common person stood out in stark contrast to the music that was being composed by major classical composers. And again, if we're thinking about the idea of music for the masses, this would be the music of the everyday common folk. So for example, if we think about maybe starting around 18th century and earlier, a really good example of what would have been popular music would have been a lot of folk songs, because that's where the vast majority of the population is. They're more of the folk group, the more peasant group, if you will, and these groups of people are going to be making music that's for them and their own personal enjoyment and not for any kind of artistic type of endeavor. The music here, just like popular music of today, is going to be much more simplified, and it's going to be using instruments that they would have easier access to than, say, perhaps some of the instruments that might be used in like an orchestra setting. Not always. Obviously, a fiddle is a really common folk instrument, and that's the violin. So people obviously can get these instruments, but instruments that can be easily cobbled together for a group setting are going to appeal to these groups of people more than, say, like an organ. And not all of these folk songs are lost to us. If you think about folk songs in your own culture, or what you might think of when you think of folk songs, those would have been popular music songs of that era that we've passed on down so long that we still recognize them to this day. In a similar vein to folk songs would be songs like nursery rhymes, ones that started off as some kind of rhyme and then eventually got put to some kind of tune. That's sort of like popular music. It would definitely be music geared more towards children, but not necessarily always. And it would have been a quick little tune you can hum to yourself. So for example, think like if you know the song Yankee Doodle or London Bridge. Those are things that we consider more like nursery rhymes, but we've also put them to some kind of melody that you can sing the tune. And they would have been popular in the times they would have been relevant. And then of course there's things like parlor music. So if you remember in my classical era music video, I talked about how during the 18th century there was kind of this shift to start composing music more for amateur musicians and the everyday common person. And it's about from this 18th century into the 19th century and beyond that we see a bigger surge in music being composed for amateur musicians. And as time goes on, this becomes a bigger and bigger market because the money is being made by you composing music to sell copies of the sheet music to amateur musicians. And of course, amateur musicians are going to love popular music. And so during the 19th century, this genre called parlor music kind of came up with the idea of it's music you gather together and play in your parlor. And one really notable composer of this genre, particularly in America, was a man called Stephen Foster. And you probably know a lot of his songs. He wrote songs such as Camptown Races, Oh Susanna, Dream of a Genie with the Light Brown Hair, etc., etc., etc. He wrote many, many songs that people would consider potentially to be folk songs, but were actually more of this parlor music type genre. Along with parlor music, there's also things of, if you remember me talking about ragtime music in my history of jazz, ragtime music could be considered to be popular music of its era because sheet music was written for it with the intent of selling it to the everyday common kind of person. And it's here that kind of helped start into popular music as we think of it today, because it's ragtime and those similar genres that really started to turn into the first genres that started having recordings sold. Because that's another thing to compare between popular music as we know it today and popular music as it was known back then. See, even saying the folk music is their popular music or the parlor music was their popular music, it's still not a completely fair comparison, because the way we consume popular music is mostly just through listening, versus back in the day it required some kind of performance. Somebody had to be a musician in order to play this music. Before the time of recordings, popular music was some kind of music that somebody would perform in a group setting and everybody gathered together to go listen to. Nowadays, it's just music that you hear. One person can record it and send out millions upon millions upon billions of copies out into the world for people to then buy and listen to, or just listen to on some kind of streaming platform. We don't consume popular music in the same way they did back then. So the way the music works and the way we think of it isn't a totally fair comparison between the two, because it doesn't serve the same kind of purpose. Because if you were to try to reverse engineer that question and say, oh, the popular music of back in the day, what is our modern equivalent of it? i.e., what is music that people just casually perform and gather around and listen to live music? We may have a few examples of that, for example, listening to live music in the park, but we don't really do that on a regular basis because we have the technology of recorded music. So overall, to totally answer the question, the answer is obviously no. Classical music back then compared to popular music today is not the same thing. It doesn't serve the same kind of purpose, it doesn't do the same kind of function, and people didn't listen to it in the same way. Popular music back then compared to popular music today is a little bit more of an equal comparison, but still not quite the same thing. So if this was a burning question of yours, I hope I finally answered this question for you in a way that made sense. And I hope that now, if you ever hear somebody ask you this question, you can be better informed and give a better explanation. Or if very least, maybe just send them this video. But that's all I have for today. If you like this video and you would like to see more like it and me answering more just random musings about music in general, then feel free to subscribe to the channel. Otherwise, I will see you next time. Goodbye.